Okay, so good evening to everyone. Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz is going to be joining us in just a couple of moments, and we're going to begin this evening's session. The title of this evening's share is Triage in the Time of COVID, Priorities for Healthcare and Life-Saving in Judaism, with Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz, somebody who is world-renowned expert on Jewish medical ethics, and we're very honored he's going to be joining us. And the session will start momentarily once Rabbi Tatz enters the Zoom room. Just give us 1 second. Just to mention, I've given you all the options to unmute yourself. So if you have a question that you want to ask, you can unmute yourself, or if you prefer, you can just write it in the chat function. But we'll try and make this session interactive, and Rabbi Tatz will just be joining us any moment now.
Vagalka, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Rabbi Tatz. Good evening. And can I begin by wishing you a very big mazel tov? I understand from Diane Binstock that you became a grandfather again today. So mazel tov to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. You should have a lot of nachas. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so privileged that Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz is joining us. No stranger to St. John's Wood and no stranger to the Jewish world. We are so honored. And we are live on Facebook Live. And we are live with the community. And I've given people the option to unmute themselves, if that's okay, if you want to allow for some interactive questions. And over to you, Rabbi Tatz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vagalka. And thanks to Rabbi Binstock as well. Can everyone hear me? Everyone hear me? Yes? No?
Everyone can hear you, but they're all muted. But okay. Everyone can hear you. They're nodding ferociously.
Good, good. So I just want to know that I'm not speaking to myself. Let me ask you, if you don't mind, to mute yourself while I begin this presentation. And then I'll be happy to take questions. I have a chat open. And of course, at the end, a little bit later, I will be happy to stop for questions and answer whatever I'm able to. So first of all, thank you for this opportunity to study or be part of this very interesting series of comparative values across societies. And what I'd like to share with you is something in my own personal field, and that is, how do we look at life and death decisions, medical halachic decisions, medical ethical decisions, where life and death is involved, in terms of the current climate of COVID life and death decisions? How do we look at these decisions? How does a non-Jewish society, how does American society look at these questions? And the vexed issue I'm thinking of in particular is the question of triage. Let me explain what I mean. Present to you an insight into a Jewish approach, authentic Jewish approach to this question. And I think you'll see for yourselves how strenuously we differ from many of the aspects of the current Western approach to making life and death choices in terms of whom do you save when you cannot save everyone. So that's our agenda. Let's talk about triage. For those of you who like references, let me show you a reference you can get hold of. That's a book. I think this is in my personal opinion, the best book available in English on this subject, and that's my own. You know, Disraeli said if I want to read a good book, I have to write it myself. I heartily agree with Disraeli, and so I've written this book, Dangerous Disease and Dangerous Therapy in Jewish Medical Ethics, and this has a long section on triage decisions. There are much more comprehensive books than mine, but this particular book I've written deals only with a narrow question of life and death, balanced decisions, risk against benefit, and so forth. So at least in English, I think it's the most extensive collection on this particular subject. And of course, you're very welcome to take a look there. If you have trouble getting it, email me. I'll be very happy to send you the relevant chapters in email with the greatest of pleasure. As I always say about my own books, if you want to understand it in depth, then you need to buy 2 copies. Then you'll really get it clear. But be that as it may, let me tell you about the question of triage. First of all, a word of background. Triage, as you know, it's an old French term from the Napoleonic Wars. When there were large numbers of injured people, you couldn't possibly save them all. And so very difficult decisions had to be made about whom you choose to save and whom you allow to die. In the First World War, of course, much closer to our own times, the simple method of triage was very crude and brutal. Those who were so-called walking wounded, you didn't attend to. Those who looked like they inevitably were going to die, you didn't attend to. You try to focus your attention on that third group who might live if you helped them and might die if you didn't. That was a very, very crude approach to triage. Today, tragically, the sophisticated triage protocols that we have almost all been developed in Israel. Talking about a country going through real-time tests of attacks, terrorist attacks, and long history of that. And so today's very sophisticated triage protocols, and at this time I'll say a little bit more about them, have been developed in Israel. But that's the general subject we're looking at. 2 people are injured. You have to decide which criteria you will use to decide whom you will give priority to. In order to approach this subject, and I hope make it interesting, I'm not sure how much time Rabbi Golka is giving me.
The session's about 45 minutes to an hour, but we're all ears.
Okay, so now I see enough nodding heads and faded expressions, then I'll stop. But in order to approach the subject and hopefully keep you awake, let me share with you a very bizarre triage dilemma, which arose as it happens in South Africa, and use that as a framework on which to build our subject. I warn you, I'm going to ask you to think deeply with me. I'm going to challenge you with some questions as we go through the subject. And I hope some of these questions will keep you up all night tonight. So here's the bizarre scenario. Pay careful attention to the details, please, because in Jewish law, as I'm sure you're aware, fine nuances in the question can make life and death differences in the answer. And the way you ask an Orthodox rabbi your question is very much the way he'll answer it. So the nuance in the question and the details of critical importance. Here's the question. A young trainee surgeon, this is going back to the time when I just myself graduated medicine. I left the country. I was working in Israel at the time. By the way, I had my own experience in the triage field in quite a harsh way. I was a military doctor in South Africa for 2 years, and not, I assure you, by choice, but because there was forced conscription during the apartheid era. And I was a military doctor for 2 years. And it was a time when there was a terrorist war in progress. There were insurgents coming across the northern border. And in fact, the first day I was sent into that border zone, 2 of my friends were shot. One died immediately, one fortunately survived. So I found myself as an army doctor in those situations in real time. So I have some traumatic memories of those sorts of choices that I had to make. But this was around that time, and a young trainee surgeon who happened to be Jewish was working in the Johannesburg hospital. I'm sure we have some South Africans on our session, Rabbi Golka, and they will tell you that it is a massive institution. It's not the largest hospital in Africa, that's Baragwanath, but it's the largest building. The building itself is 1 kilometer long. If you should be so minded as to lie down on the floor in the main entrance of the main corridor and look along the corridor for 1 kilometer, you can see the curvature of the earth, okay? Literally. This building you can see from outer space, and it is a massive medical institution. Now, at one end of that hospital, they have a very slick trauma unit, which is known as the accident service. It's a dedicated branch of the casualty department. It deals with patients brought in from hundreds of miles around with a sophisticated helicopter service. It's a very, very busy trauma unit. This Jewish doctor training in surgery was rotating through that unit, and he found himself in a very interesting dilemma situation. And here's the dilemma. The hospital had acquired a new machine. It was a very sophisticated new ventilator or ventilator resuscitator. I was no longer there, as I said, so I can't tell you the exact details, but it was a very sophisticated machine that could give badly injured people the best chance of staying alive. But the hospital had issued a very peculiar instruction. The instruction was, no doctor on duty may use this machine on any patient whom he considers to be non-salvageable. In other words, if you have a patient who's so badly injured that your medical judgment is that this patient could not possibly survive beyond the very short term, you may not use the machine at all. Use older technology. Don't use this machine for people who are unsalvageable. Let me ask you, what do you think would be the reason for that? Why would they outlaw the use of a machine that could keep people alive a little bit longer when there's no one else around? Well, I'm sure you all know the answer, and the answer is because they were justly concerned that if you put the patient who's not salvageable on this machine, what happens 10 minutes later when someone else arrives who is salvageable and you no longer have the machine available? We only have one. And therefore, don't do that. Now, the obvious challenge to that, the obvious challenge is, well, why don't you simply put the first person on the machine, and 10 minutes later, when another person arrives who's more hopeful and more potentially salvageable, take the machine from the first person and put it on the second? I mean, isn't that obvious? Well, the hospital said the reason they wouldn't allow that was, now listen well, is because if you put the first person on the machine and 20 minutes later somebody else arrives who's potentially salvageable, and you walk over to the first person to switch off the machine, this newly traumatized family standing around will object. You mean you're switching off this machine on our uncle, our father, grandfather, and there will be scenes of hysteria and chaos. We don't want that. Don't get into that situation in the first place. Now, Jewishly, that's completely irrelevant. A family's emotional response, a reaction, has got no part to play in this type of life and death drama, and therefore that would be invalid. But we have another reason why that consideration may be valid, and it's a very important one indeed. And that is, in Jewish law, if somebody's on a machine, any modality that keeps them alive from moment to moment, you may not switch that off, and not even to save someone else. The rule is ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh. You cannot push aside one life, not even to save another. And an act of murder, homicide, or foreshortening a life is not acceptable. I'm not saying you have to put everyone on the machine in the first place, but if someone's on a machine and you need to switch it off, which is actively terminating the life of that person, in Jewish law, nothing doing. So let's rephrase the question Jewishly. Here's this young doctor. He has a patient who is unsalvageable. There's no one else around. But he knows that if he puts this person on the machine, inevitably, somebody will arrive shortly who will need the machine. And by the way, when he phrased this question to a world-famous rabbi who happened to be in South Africa at the time, happened to be Rav Moshe Sternbuch, he added to his question this detail. He said, this hospital is so busy that the scenario is guaranteed. Guaranteed. That means I can guarantee you that if I put patient A on the machine who's not salvageable, there will be a salvageable patient in short order. That is a statistical guarantee. I'm not going to debate tonight whether such a notion is valid halachically or not. It happens to be a valid notion. I'm going to take that for granted in terms of our discussion, which means I'm not asking you a doubt. Maybe someone else will arrive later. That's a totally different situation. I'm talking about guaranteed. We accept the axiom for points with this discussion that that is a guaranteed reality, which means patient A not salvageable here now, patient B guaranteed to be here sometime in the near future, and when patient B arrives who's salvageable, they will die because patient A is on the machine and I may not switch it off. Under those circumstances, he asked the rabbi, as a Jewish doctor, what is my duty? Am I obliged to obey the hospital instruction, which means keep the machine in abeyance, watch my first patient die sooner, but save a guaranteed life that will come in later? Or does Judaism require me to disobey that instruction, go against the rules, suffer discipline, and maybe lose my job, put the first person on the machine with no authority to do so, and not only that, watch someone die in 20 minutes time because we guarantee that someone else will arrive and I may not switch off the machine on the first person? That was the question he put to the rabbi. Let me pause for just a moment to ask, are we all clear about the question? Any questions with the question? Okay, that's our fascinating dilemma. If you think about it, this is a weird example of a triage question. Normally triage means there are two people in front of me, one on the left, one on the right. I must make a choice. In this scenario, there are two people. Well, there's one person here now and a second guaranteed person to come later. It is, after all, a choice between two people. Just a little strange. They're not both here now, but the second one's guaranteed. How does Judaism approach that question? Well, the rabbi gave an answer. He then sent, and you can look this up, those of you who'd like a reference, it's in the famous work called Chuvas van Hoges, a very short answer to this question. He then sent the question to Rav the Tzitz Eliezer of Waldenberg, very, very famous, massively famous personalities, particularly in the area of Jewish medical law in Jerusalem. And again, for those who'd like to look it up, in the Tzitz Eliezer in volume 17, Chuvas 72. Actually, there's an earlier Chuva as well. There's a too long responsa in that volume. I'm sure Rabbi Golka would be most happy to learn through it with you. It's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating, very lengthy source. He goes through all the Talmudic precedents. He gives a ruling as well. And then they sent the question to another famous authority, Rav Zilberstein in Bnei Brak, Rabbi Elyashiv's son-in-law. These are three of the most best-known, broadest shoulders in the halachic world. And true to form, to this very clear yes or no question, there were three completely different answers. Now, I'm going to tell you how those three answers are based on a hair's breadth of judgment about this life and death question. But in order to tell you what the rulings were, let's take a trip, a brief survey, a brief voyage, if you like, through the area of triage in Jewish law. We'll study the principles, and then with your permission, we'll circle back to our question of the ventilator, and I'll invite you, St. John's Wood halachic black belts, to figure out the answer to our question. And I'm sure you will do it with ease. And I'm sure for every correct answer, Rabbi Golka is going to buy you a whiskey, whatever you're into in St. John's Wood. Okay, so let's take a little trip through the law, the area of triage in Judaism. Let me clarify the principles, and then we'll try to bring them to focus on our question. First of all, let me point out to you that triage is a broad issue. It isn't only stopping at an accident where two people are injured and having to make a decision. By the way, I don't know if people stop at accidents anymore. In the United States, they don't stop because they don't want to get sued. In South Africa, they don't want to get AIDS. In Britain here, they're probably too polite. But be that as it may, you stop at an accident, two people are injured, which one do you choose? That's the obvious and well-known, and every doctor's been in that situation, and I myself have been in that situation countless times. But triage is much broader. For example, let's say you are the administrator of a hospital. Are you allowed to spend money on well baby clinics where they measure the babies and give them vitamins when you don't have enough intensive care surgical beds? That's triage too. You don't have to be a doctor for that. May a country spend money on its parks and museums when you don't have enough military and intensive care medical? That's triage too. In the COVID era, when you shut down a society in order to not overload the hospitals and save lives, you're costing lives too. Big economic issues are life and death questions too. Let me give you an example. People think, it's a decision between money and life, saving lives on the one hand, NHS, etc., and saving money on the other hand. No, in Jewish law, saving money in that sense is life too. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, there was a young couple living in a certain European city, Jewish couple, and they found themselves unable to have children, very distressed. After years of trying, they ended up at a very slick fertility unit at a Tel Aviv hospital. Now, they had a baby. Now, they happened to be an exceptionally wealthy couple. And in his joy, the father made a massive donation to the hospital, but on condition being that he wants his money to be used to help other people have children. Well, this was an Israeli situation. They have their own opinions. And the hospital director said, no, that's immoral of you to help other people have children when I've got dying people who need to be treated. In Jewish law, pikuach nefesh, that always comes first. You have no right to fund fertility services when I've got dying people. So the man said, fine, I'm not giving my money. This reminds me of, instead of just taking the money, this reminds me of the Panovich Rov. The Panovich Rov was a very shrewd halachic genius who lived in the last generation. The Panovich Rov once had a friend who was exceptionally wealthy and exceptionally philanthropic, but Jewishly a little challenged. This friend once promised the rabbi enough money to build an entire yeshiva, entire religious school, on condition that the rabbi promised that the students would not have to wear these. The rabbi promised, he took the money, and he built a girls' school. He built a Beis Yaakov. Now, that's the way to handle those situations. But anyway, in this case, they couldn't come to an agreement. They went to see Rabbi Yoshiv, and I heard this from his son-in-law, the giant halachic, the size of the generation. And he said, the man's fully entitled to give his money to the fertility service. So the hospital director said, Rabbi, don't you know Jewish law? Pikuach nefesh, saving lives comes first. Listen to what the rabbi said. He said, a country needs a normal spread of facilities. When you start funding only emergencies, people get an embattled mentality. That affects morale. That's life and death too. You need very broad shoulders to be able to say that. But we learn from this that a society has there are different priorities when it comes to societal needs than necessarily an individual. This is very relevant in our COVID era. That's one example. And there are no end of bizarre examples. Let me give you one of the strangest. If this doesn't move you, there's no hope for you. Some years ago, a wealthy American donated a kidney dialysis machine to Laniado Hospital. In Netanya, an orthodoxly run hospital, this American donated a kidney dialysis machine on condition that it may only be used for tourists. What's the rationale? Well, any American in kidney failure will never get to visit Israel. No country is going to dialyze you when it doesn't have enough for its own people. So you'll never visit Israel. Fine. He put the machine into Netanyahu. Any American visiting Israel will travel around the country. Every 2 or 3 nights, he'll sleep over on dialysis. And between sessions, he'll fly home. Well, you can guess what happened. They put the machine in. Immediately, someone arrived in kidney failure who needed it, who was not a tourist. They went to the Rabbi, the Klausenberger Rabbi, who ran the hospital. What do? Pikuach Nefesh used the machine. The machine is now used constantly. Do not ask me what would happen if a tourist and a non-tourist arrived at the same time. I have no idea. But these are some of the situations that you get in triage. So those are very broad societal issues. And triage is used throughout. You know, if you walk into a local NHS hospital and you say you have chest pain, the first thing you'll hear is triage. And someone skilled at rapid assessment of your case will run over. And within moments, they'll analyze how urgent your case is. And if they decide that you're a total screaming emergency, you only wait until Tuesday. And if it's not that serious, you wait till February. With all due respect, I mean, NHS is wonderful, wonderful. But, in public health systems, so triage is used across the board, and it's a very broad societal issue, not only an acute issue of people who are individually threatened. However, let's turn our attention to the immediate question of 2 people in front of us. Let's simplify this. Let's talk about, I walk into a room, there are 2 people, I must make a choice between 2 individuals. The classic triage situation. How do we make that decision? Now, I mentioned Israeli triage protocols, most of which are accepted around the world, internationally. Hatzalah people, when they get to what they call a mass casualty incident, they are very well-known principles. For example, people are coded with tags. Black means they're dead, red means something else, yellow means something else. One of the rules in such situations is you may not treat anyone till you've triaged everyone. In other words, no matter how badly someone is injured, you may not stop to treat them until you've assessed everyone, because you stand a chance of saving more when you have an overview of the situation. That's not necessarily valid in Jewish law. Not necessarily valid. In Tel Aviv, a few years ago, there was an attack. Many people were injured, about 20 people. The first doctor on scene was a young lady doctor. And the first person she came to was a 7-year-old boy bleeding badly from his neck. She put a finger on the bleeding and stopped the bleeding, and now she had a dilemma. Do I save this child's life, remain here? Do I let him die and bleed to death while I triage the other 19 people? In Jewish law, you don't move. You cannot do something that will kill this person, even though there's a maybe others will be in danger as well, but you've got a certainty against a maybe. And a certainty, a vadai against a sofek in Jewish law, you prioritize the vadai. Incidentally, this does not necessarily apply in a military situation. We don't have time tonight to go into military triage, fascinating field, but the rules are not the same. I'll just briefly give you one example, which I actually heard from an Israeli doctor whose friend was the doctor involved. There was during the Lebanon situation, a group of Israeli soldiers was sent across the border. With them was a very senior ranking Israeli army surgeon and a young 18-year-old paramedic. This surgeon, completely secular individual, who told the story after the fact to the person I heard it from, he said he crossed the border, and soon after entered Lebanese territory, one of the Israeli soldiers was very badly injured. And this surgeon knew that if he radioed for a helicopter and had the man flown back to Haifa, he would almost certainly survive, but only if he went with him in the helicopter. But if he sent him back with a medic, so he could stay with his men, the soldier would almost certainly die. He said he didn't know what to do. What's his duty? Stay with your men and let him die, or go back and save his life and leave the other soldiers without medical cover? He said for the first time in his secular life, he started praying very hard, and a big helicopter came and it took them all. Now, that's not the point of the question, although I'm sure it's the point of another question. But when he got back from that incident, he asked his religious medical friend what he should have done. And that doctor went to Rabbi Elyashiv, the same great halachic authority. Rabbi Elyashiv said, if that would have been a civilian circumstance, there's no question you go back with the injured man. You have a certainly injured now, and a possibly will be injured later. Vadai against a sofek, you prioritize the certainty. But in the army, you stay put. In the army, danger to life has already been factored into the situation. You can't say I'm a soldier, but it's too dangerous. If the country needs to be defended and you need to put your life on the line, then that is the priority. So military triage is not the same as civilian triage. Anyway, this is a fascinating field, but let me limit our discussion for the moment to 2 individuals, keep it as simple as possible. What are the basic principles of triage? So I have 2 people, and they're both in front of me. I walk into a room. What are the criteria I apply to choose between 2 individuals? I give you 5 seconds to unmute yourself or type something on my screen. What's the first element or differential you would use to tell between two people? Give me an option. 5 seconds.
How old they are.
Age. The first suggestion is age. And I presume by that you mean younger before older. I presume. This is not a simple situation. Most rabbinic authorities have ruled that the young become before old. Some indeed rule that the old come before the young. This is certainly a very interesting suggestion. It is not, by the way, in the secular world, they also debate this question. Should a young person who has more life to live be prioritized, or should an older person be recognized for the contribution they've already made to society and be saved? Not so simple. There's a lot of interesting debate about this. I think that's a good criterion, but it's certainly not the first one we would use usually. Any other options?
How they look.
You mean seriously injured?
Which one looks worse?
I'll come to that in a moment. Indeed. Let's leave the medical differential out for the moment. Any ladies like to?
Which one's nearest to you?
Oh, great, beautiful. Yes, I'll get to that. Indeed. When I give this talk in America, they always say to me, Rabbi, which one's insurance? Okay. That's not right. That's not right. Some suggest gender. They say women should come before the men. And when I ask them why, they say because they can have children. And then I remind them that men are also necessary, let's not forget that. But be that as it may, in Jewish law, gender is not a priority. Gender is not a priority. In fact, let me ask you an interesting question. Which of your parents comes first in Jewish law? Your mother or your father? Let's say your mother and your father.
Mother.
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 I lost him.
It's frozen.
Rabbi Tatz, we've lost you. We need to do some technological triage to get you back.
Choose between you and there.
Just while we're
You're on.
Rabbi, are you with us?
What's his first name?
Just while we're waiting for Rabbi Tatz to rejoin, does anyone have any questions in the meantime on anything that's been said so far that we can put together for when he does come back on? If you do.
I think you'll have to finish the share, Rabbi Yoni. Good luck with that.
Well, Gary, I was going to nominate you actually as one of the most knowledgeable lay leaders in the community. Hold on, I'm just phoning.
I have heard this share before. It's jolly good.
It's all quite logical.
He hasn't answered about the machine, though.
Yeah.
He's left us on a cliffhanger. I'm trying to get him right back. One moment.
He's going to come back to that at the end, he said.
He's going to come back.
It's Gary.
Yes.
How are the Colemans? I haven't seen you for ages.
We haven't seen you. Well, thank you. How are you, Gary?
Oh, fed up, like everyone else, I guess.
Aren't we all?
Aren't we all? Yeah. Are you still doing the Pirkei Avot share with Dan Binstock?
No.
Yes, we are.
Oh,
We're not going to Shacharis.
We don't go to Shacharit anymore.
He doesn't do that in Shacharis.
No. Pick up what? No.
When
does he do that?
We were
the pearls of prayer. Is it?
first lockdown. We were learning ethics of the fathers together at lunchtime with Michael Cole.
Yes, he stopped that. He's thinking of restarting.
Okay.
Rabbi Tatz is going to be with us in a couple of minutes. Sorry, Rabbi Tatz having a couple of technical difficulties. He's just restarted his router and he's hoping to rejoin us in just a couple of minutes. So we are making a list of all the mitigating factors you would try and decipher if you saw two people in front of you. We've talked about the concept of age. We've talked about the concept of how ill they look. Somebody's written in the chat survivability. I think Shlomi Cohen wrote that. If you want to tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that. Does anybody have any other mitigating factors that you might consider significant?
How about if you knew the person?
If you knew them. So, there was a case some years ago, and perhaps we'll ask about this, of a terrorist situation where one of the people who were injured was, in fact, the terrorist himself versus the person who he's carried out this terrible crime against. Would you, in halakha, presumably, would you be treating the victim as opposed to the person who's caused the scene.
The victim first.
Whatever halakha says, I would do the victim. Stop the other fellow.
These are very, very tough questions, which I'm hoping
I'll go with.
going to reconnect.
I'm going to add proximity to the list.
Proximity.
Proximity, Rabbi, on who's close.
Rabbi G 1 2 3.
Yeah.
Yes. Maybe one could do more good than the other.
Well, maybe. Yeah, I mean, this is a question. The Gemara is.
But how would you know that?
How would you know
when
who's
they're both lying
picking
across?
on who?
Well, you don't know them. You don't know them.
No.
Okay.
How could you possibly know?
Well, you might know their background. Fees.
Oh, yeah, if he's paid his shul fees.
Age.
And he needs you to see to his router.
While we're waiting, I'm going to share my screen with you. Just Rabbi Tatz needs a couple more minutes to sort out his internet problems. But while we're waiting, I'm going to share with you a fantastic clip that actually is related to this discussion. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try and share my screen with you. Hold on. Sec.
Don't say me. Give us a song while
Yes.
Howard Calvert, how was your talk last night?
Ooh, Gary, speak to you another time about it.
Last year,
Okay.
1 second. Sorry.
a school in Los Angeles was making.
In Wembley, there's the one who's never grown older. No, English guy. No.
It's nice that you can see it's true.
Oh, for goodness sake, he had a home in Portugal.
Okay, I'm going to just share with you my screen just for a couple of minutes while we're waiting for Rabbi Tatz to rejoin. It's a beautiful, inspirational clip. Not wait a moment. Hold on 1 second. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
When Joel Bess was 17 years old, he was learning in a yeshiva in Israel. For the summer, he came back to LA where he got a summer job. One day, a friend of his, Yechiel Salzberg, who was his roommate back in Israel in yeshiva, called him and said, Joel, I always wanted to come visit LA. Would it be okay if I come for a few days?
I said, of course, come to Los Angeles to come stay at my house. And he decided he's going to come with his friend Morty.
On this trip, I actually rented a car. And the car that I rented was in my name and only I was able to drive.
One night, Joel couldn't fall asleep. He was bored. And he notices that Yechiel left the car keys on the table.
Morty and I decided that we were going to take the car without permission. We drove it. It was about 4 blocks away.
He's speeding. Nobody's on the road. It's 2 o'clock in the morning.
This car backs up and we smash right into it. And as we smash right into it, I remember thinking, oh my God. I said, we got to get out of here. This car's not under our name. We have no insurance. We're going to get into so much trouble. I told Morty, I said, let's just jump out of here and run. We run into my house and we're both shaking.
They walked back into the apartment with a look, like a ghostly look on their faces. And I said, what happened?
Well, okay. We borrowed your car without permission and we got into an accident.
Being an 18-year-old kid, I kind of panicked. I didn't know what to do.
Joel says, I have an idea. Why don't we go back to the crime scene, to the accident, and tell them that you drove the car. But because you thought that you were being carjacked, you were afraid and you ran away. Now that you feel safe, the cops are there, you're coming back and you want to take care of it, you want to pay for the damage.
So he goes, oh, that's such a great idea. I'm going to do that. So I guide Yechiel towards the accident, and me and Morty are watching, and he tells the cop the story.
It was an older cop that was training a rookie cop. And he looked at me and he said, what happened? And I said, well, I was driving, I hit her, I got scared, I heard in LA, carjackings, I'm not from here, I just ran, but I came right back. So he said, so you hit her and you left. I said, no, but I came right back. Because you hit her and you left, that's a hit and run, turn around, and he cuffed me.
And I look at Morty and I go, oh my God, what are we going to do? This guy's getting arrested. He's just in so much trouble right now, and it's all our fault.
Then he took me downtown, put me in a holding cell with a bunch of people, and it was just the worst nightmare of a story you could imagine for something that I didn't do.
The next day, Yechiel got out on bail.
He looks at me and he goes, you guys are disgusting.
Okay, Rabbi Tatz is with us again. So for those of you who want to see the end of that video clip, I'll share it with you at the end of the session. So you can watch the end of that video clip. Rabbi Tatz, are you with us?
I'm sure that clip was much more interesting than whatever I have to say, but you're back with me. I'm sorry about the internet connection. They were probably having triage issues about who gets the service and who doesn't. Anyway, I'll speak fast and apologize for the lack of connection. Okay, so we were talking about the criteria for triage. Two people in front of me. We spoke about gender, age, etc. Let me tell you what probably comes first. The question of which parent comes first is the time to talk about that as well. The most basic criterion probably in Jewish law is who's physically closer to me. In other words, this comes way before other considerations. I walk into a room and I have two people. If I walk in from here, I'm obliged Jewishly to treat the person I get to first before moving on to the second person. And the reason for that is because we have a very basic principle in Jewish law called Ein ma'avirin ala mitzvot. You may not bypass a mitzvah. If you put your hand in your tefillin bag in the morning, you take out the wrong one, you're in trouble. You can't bypass and set aside a mitzvah. You need to deal with the mitzvah. As soon as you approach this first individual, you're now beholden, incumbent on you now, of the mitzvah of life-saving, prioritized over virtually everything else in Judaism. You can't walk past that to somebody else. And therefore, proximity is the most basic of all criteria. And that has tremendous applications in many circumstances. It's partly the reason why we have a first come, first served rule, but certainly priority is given to proximity. Next question. What happens if they're equidistant and one is your brother? Who comes first, the stranger or your brother? If you feel it's your brother, raise your hand. Okay, if you feel it's the stranger, raise your hand. Well, I wonder if you have a brother. Anyway, the point is now, in Jewish law, family comes first. And by the way, it has nothing to do with whether you like them or not. Family comes first. And the reason for that is a verse in the Torah, in Nach. Mibsarcha lotit alem, do not ignore your flesh. This, incidentally, is why you owe charity, stocker, to family members before others. Parents come first, in fact, after that grandparents, a very interesting hierarchy in Jewish law. But there's no question that parents come first, whether you like them or not. It's not dependent on the relationship. So charity goes to family members first. After that, a neighbor comes before a stranger, a friend before someone else. Someone in your city gets priority over someone in a different city. Judaism posits a hierarchical set of concentric obligations. And so people living in your town, halachically, are prioritized before people in other cities, except for Jerusalem. Anyone living in Yerushalayim has equal priority to someone in your city, because notionally we all live there. Many rabbinic authorities say it applies to anyone in Israel in general. So you can prioritize Israeli causes along with London causes, but London comes before Manchester if you live in London. So that is the rule of relationship. And the most basic of relationships, obviously, is a blood relationship. And so you need to treat your brother before you treat a stranger. Now, stay with me carefully. What's the next question I'm going to ask you? Which is the next triage dilemma I must ask you now? And you'll make my day if you get this right. I'll just be so happy for the rest of the day. What is the next? We spoke about age, proximity, relationship. The last two we discussed were proximity and relationship. What must be the next dilemma to consider?
While you were offline, Rabbi Tatz, we were discussing whether it's a tzaddik or rasha, whether they're good or evil, and in context of a terrorist, where that's been a real life dilemma. When they disrupt the suicide bombing, do they treat the terrorist or not?
Yes, indeed. So
one spouse.
One spouse. Yes, indeed. That's
no relation to terrorists. Yeah.
donating organs.
Yes. No, one spouse is a very good point. In Jewish law, your spouse is not considered related to you. She's considered you. Okay, there's no closer relationship. That's fascinating. Look, I don't. Mr. John Nathan is asking this question. I'm not sure you're going to enjoy the answer. But your spouse, you're obliged to pay all her expenses, all her fines, her burial expenses, her children's expenses, even if they're not yours. You redeem her from captivity if she's captured by terrorists, assuming, of course, you never hired them in the first place. That's what you're obliged. No, I'm not thinking on those lines. Now stay with me carefully. Listen well, and I hope you'll enjoy this. Number one, proximity. Number two, relationship. Now, the obvious question to ask now is, what if I walk into the room from here and this one is closer, but that one's my brother? Which priority takes priority? You see, that must be the next question. As soon as we set up two priorities in Judaism, the next logical question is, which priority takes priority? Do you treat your brother first because he's your brother, or the one who's closer because he's closer? They both have Torah bases, these two principles. Well, the answer is, you treat your brother first. You bypass the closer person and you go to your brother. And I'm not going to tell you why. This is what I hope keeps you up all night tonight. And this is worth a top-class single malt whiskey to figure out what is the logic. And I'm sure our Gokul will be happy to think it through with you. What is the logic that we bypass the closer, which has a Torah basis, to get to your relative, which has a Torah basis as well? But be that as it may, we bypass. You know, let me tell you something amazing about proximity. In Hadassah Hospital, this must be 1949, somewhere around there were 8 children with meningitis and only enough penicillin for 2. You know, penicillin was newly available in 1948, 49, and there were 8 children, meningitis, exquisitely sensitive to penicillin, was virtually a guaranteed cure, and they had only enough for 2. The doctors in Israel went to the chief rabbi, Rabbi Herzog, and they asked him, Rabbi, what does Judaism say? Which 2 children do we save? Rabbi Herzog called Rav Moshe Feinstein in New York. I heard from someone who was present there during the conversation. Rav Moshe said, tell the doctors to walk into the ward and give it to the first 2 children. And Rav Herzog said, well, a boy come first, a girl come first? How do we do? Nothing doing, said Rav Feinstein. You walk into the room, the first child, the second child, and then you have no more. That is how we are solving that problem in. So when it comes to, now let's talk about differential threat. I don't want to keep you late. I'll sum it up for you. One is badly injured and one is less. One is salvageable and one is not. In Jewish law, we call that chayei sha'ah. That means temporary or terminal illness. The other one's called chayei olam. Technically, for definition of purposes of this definition, 1 year is called non-salvageable. 1 year is called terminal with regard to this particular discussion. So you walk into a room and there are 2 people. One is salvageable, one is not. Which one do you save? This is a no-brainer. Do you save the salvageable? Raise your hand, please. Of course you do. But what happens if you walk in from here? You walk into the room, one is salvageable, one is not, but the salvageable one is more distant. Now, there's no question you have to save somebody for a month or 2 months or 3 months. In Judaism, you can break Shabbos to save somebody for 1 extra moment. So you have a Torah obligation to save this life, but it's a terminal life. Do you walk past him and save the person at a distance? Yes, you do. In Jewish law, when you have a salvageable against a non-salvageable, you prioritize the salvageable person, even if they're not closer to you. This does not apply if the closer person is conscious. If you walk past the closer person and they're aware of what's happening, you may not do so. What's the reason? Because when you walk past them and they feel, I'm dying, I'm hopeless, they're abandoning me, that makes him die sooner. And a person's emotional status, any good doctor knows, is highly relevant to their survival. That you may not do. But if they're unaware and totally unconscious, you bypass them and you go to the closer, you go to the more distant person who is salvageable. All together so far? Now watch carefully, here comes the key. Sit on the edge of your seat, please, and stay with me, here comes the key. Watch what's happening. I'm walking past somebody whom ordinarily I have a obligation to save. To save this person, I'll be allowed to break Shabbat, eat on Yom Kippur, eat unkosher food, do virtually anything to save this life. And I'm abandoning him. Why? To save somebody who is a priority. Now listen carefully, here's the key. In Jewish law, whenever you abandon, whenever you walk over, you override a Torah prohibition to save a life, there's one requirement that must be satisfied. And that is, when you are trying to save a life in contravention of Kashrut, Yom Kippur, Shabbat, or any other Jewish law, you may do so provided the life that you're trying to save is here now. That's called a choleh lefanenu. You need somebody specified, identified, and present. You cannot do research on Shabbat that will save lives down the line. Meritorious, amazing, wonderful, happens to be forbidden. You need somebody here now. That's called a choleh lefanenu. If he's here now, you identify the person, there's a pressing need now, you break Shabbat. Is this clear? Okay. Now here comes the question. What's called in front of us? Same room, same hospital, same city. What's the notion of lefanenu? This was laid down by the Nodi Yehuda in the 1700s. The Chasam Sofer, writing later, talks about it. And I won't take time now with all the references and sources. But let me tell you what they write. Lefanenu in Jewish law doesn't mean geographical proximity. It means a real, identified individual. For example, in Britain today and in many countries in Australia, United States, transplants are done in order of priority on a computerized national recipient list, which means that when doctors take 2 kidneys in the Royal Free tomorrow morning, they don't even know who's going to get those kidneys. It may be a patient in Brighton or in Birmingham. That's called in front of us because there's a national list, there's a name on the list, there's somebody's life at stake and they're waiting for a kidney. The geographical distance is not the point. Clear? Are we together on that? Let me give you a dramatic example. 1986, a baby was born in heart failure in Northern California. The doctor was a famous chest surgeon called Norman Shumway and decided for the first time in history to attempt a transplant into a newborn. Let me remind you that transplantation only began in 1967 in a certain country. I presume you all know where that was. Anyone know? Yeah, well, of course, South Africa, no question about that. And the first time a baby's heart was ever transplanted was in 1986, never been done before. But Dr. Shumway decided to try because this child was dying. What's the hardest part of transplanting a heart into a newborn? The hardest part is finding a heart. Where do you find a newborn heart? Most hearts for transplantation are taken from young men who've ridden their motorcycles into walls at 100 miles an hour, right? You know, the American surgeons call them donor cycles. Anyway, there are not too many newborns riding their motorcycles into walls. So they scoured the United States and they found a baby available to be a donor in Vermont. But Vermont is 3,000 miles away from California, but there was no other hope. So what they did was they hired a private jet in California. They put the youngest doctor on the team into the jet in California. They flew him 3,000 miles across the country. He cut out the heart of the donor child in Vermont, and they could not get the plane started to get him back. They ended up scrambling a United States Air Force supersonic fighter, put this terrified young doctor in the back of a supersonic fighter with a heart in a box on his lap. When they got back to California, they had to resuscitate the doctor. But they did, and they saved the life of the baby in California. That 6,000 miles in Jewish law is called lefanenu. You get the point? It's not the geographical distance. It's the fact that there's a real-time life to be saved now. That's called lefanenu. Are we all together on this? Okay. Let's come back to our question of the ventilator, and I'll tell you what happened. And you black belts are going to solve this question with me. Remember our question? We've got this newfangled machine, and we have only one of them. So here, imagine the situation. Jewish doctor comes on duty, 8 o'clock in the morning, walks in, sits down to study his daf yomi, Talmud, like all Jewish surgeons do. And they say, doctor, somebody badly injured. He runs over, checks out the patient, and sees that there's no way this patient could live. Good doctors can always tell exactly how long people are going to live. South African doctors, we get it down to the minute. No question about that. So you can see this person's got no hope. There's no way they could survive, but you've got your newfangled machine. You'd like to put the machine on the patient. Just as you're about to do so, the door opens and you notice them wheeling in a salvageable patient. They're more distant, but they're salvageable. Which patient gets the machine? And they're hopelessly unconscious. Which one gets the machine? The one closer to you or the one they're wheeling in? If you feel it's the one they're wheeling in who's salvageable, please raise your hand. Of course. Is from the door to here called lefanenu, in front of us? Absolutely. Sure, the other one's closer, but we said you override the closer person if they're not salvageable, provided the second person is lefanenu. From here to the door, lefanenu. Great. Scenario number 2. 8 in the morning, you come on duty, newfangled hospital, badly injured person, no hope for them. Just about to put them on the machine, the phone rings. And on the phone, they tell you the ambulance is on its way. 10 miles away in the ambulance is a salvageable patient. If you wait 10 minutes, they'll be here, you save their life. Raise your hand if you wait, please. Norman, what do you say? Absolutely. From here, 10 minutes away, is that called lefanenu? Sure, we said 6,000 miles is lefanenu. Great. Number 3, 8 in the morning, badly injured person. No hope, about to put the machine on. The radio crackles to life. And on the radio, you hear that the helicopter's on its way, 150 miles away in the helicopter. If you wait an hour, a salvageable person will be here. Raise your hand if you wait. Absolutely, no question about it. 150 miles. Now here comes the question, and here comes the black belt question. And think before you answer, please. 8 in the morning, badly injured person, newfangled machine. You're about to put them on the machine, hopeless patient. No door opens, no phone rings, no radio call. But there's a statistical guarantee that someone's going to be here. Is a statistical lefanenu called lefanenu? What do you say to that? Hey, you've got to enjoy the question before you answer. You've got to enjoy the question. It's an amazing question. What is the notion of lefanenu? Is it the presence of a person or the guarantee of saving a life? Normally, those two issues are conflated. Normally, a lefanenu means there's somebody here whose life I wish to save. In our strange case, there's no one here, but there's a guaranteed life to be saved. We guaranteed that statistically. If I put the first person on the machine, someone's going to die in half an hour's time. Is that qualified for lefanenu? That's an amazing question. Let me tell you the responses to that question, and you can consider your verdict and see with which one you agree. The rabbi was consulted, ruled that the hospital is correct. Don't give up your job. Don't have to jeopardize your career. Keep the machine in abeyance like they want you to. Do your best for the first patient and keep the machine to save the second life. That's perfectly in order. The second opinion was nothing doing. That's not called here now. That's not called lefanenu. Put the machine on the patient now. What happens half an hour from now, you'll deal with it then. And I think you can see the legitimate two options here. It depends on a hair's breadth of a philosophical notion of what do we call real and present. Let me finish with a third opinion, because this is beyond wild. And I'll stop with that unless you have any questions. Here's the third opinion. When I heard this 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I thought it was beyond bizarre, but it's about to become a reality. The third opinion by this very learned rabbi was, the two options I've just mentioned are both wrong. Here's the correct solution. Take your newfangled machine and attach to it a clock and a bell. And here's what you do. As soon as the first person arrives, without a moment's hesitation, put them on the machine. Set the timer running. Half an hour later, the bell rings to warn you, and the machine trips and switches off automatically. Switch it on again and keep it running. Half an hour later, it switches off, switch it on again. Keep doing that till the second person arrives. As soon as they arrive, wait till the machine switches off. And instead of switching it on the first person, switch it on. Now, whether the Johannesburg hospital would like Shabbat clocks on its ventilators, I don't know. But that's what the rabbi suggested, and believe it or not, it's about to become a reality. I had the honor of addressing the ethics.
Oh, what a shame. What a shame. He was fantastic.
What's his first name?
He's left us on a cliffhanger. I'm hoping he'll rejoin us in a moment. Rabbi Tatz, are you with us? There are a bunch of interesting questions that we want to try and ask him before we get him back, before we end the session.
Rabbi Golka, you?
Oh, Rabbi Tatz, you with us?
No.
Rabbi Tatz.
Shame.
Hopefully he'll be rejoining us momentarily. I think I heard him there a second ago. Would you like me to show you the end of that video clip while we're waiting? I know it's a bit too, we're too absorbed in this topic right now.
What a shame.
Let's just give him a minute to try and rejoin. I'm just looking through the question column. We've got some very interesting questions over here. Somebody's written, what about a Jewish patient versus a Gentile? What if the unsalvageable person is your brother? How about the COVID question about shutting down society, trying to save lives versus saving the economy? So we've got some really interesting questions that hopefully Rabbi Tatz will be able to come and conclude the session. Rabbi Tatz, you with us?
Yes, I am. You know what? I'm going to speak fast for 2 more minutes, if I may. I'm sorry about this.
Okay, brilliant. We've got some fantastic questions in the chat that we'd love you to address.
Let me just complete this, if I may. This problem with the machines, this timers on the machines, is not as bizarre as it sounds. And it's not a cowardly way to switch off machines and let people die. In Judaism, that's definitely not allowed. But I'll tell you where it applies. There are many circumstances, but I'll give you one. 3 in the morning, you're a doctor in a hospital. Here comes an 85-year-old gentleman who's been smoking for 50 years, terrible lungs, he's got an infection, he cannot breathe. You know, if you put him on a machine, he may never get off that machine. This is a terrible decision to make as a doctor. And if you put him on that machine and he languishes on it for 3 months and then dies, during which time other people have no access to that machine, that's a terrible thing to do. And I've had sleepless nights making those decisions. And you know how we try to solve the problem? We try our best to diagnose the ones who look like they'll survive and put them on the machines, and the others we send home to die. And even South African doctors don't always get that right. New solution. Put them on the machine right away, but say, my dear sir, this machine only runs for 3 days, and then it switches off. If during these 3 days you show signs of recovery, we'll keep treating you. But if it proves that you are hopeless, we'll simply let the machine switch off. We won't do it. We'll let it switch off, and we'll then give it to somebody else. And lest you accuse me of using the machine to kill somebody, I gave him 3 extra days. I gave him a trial of therapy that he wouldn't have had otherwise. Okay? And therefore, these machines, Sharet Tzedek has just run a trial on non-human machinery, and now about to run a human trial, and coming to a hospital near you soon, almost certainly will be these machines on timers. Anyway, that's a brief approach to this question. I hope you enjoyed talking about, learning about some of the principles in Judaism. I'm very happy to see it as long as our connection lasts. If I'm capable of answering any questions, I'm very happy to try and do so.
If I can ask Rabbi Tatz, first of all, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to try and put your questions in the chat, and we can try and get through as many as we can in the short remaining time we have. The first question is really in relation to COVID, shutting down society to try and save lives, balancing the economy with life-saving tips. How would you advise the government if you were invited to cabinet meetings on this topic?
This is really a question of the delicate balance that a society needs to make. That is quite correct. What exactly the balance should be is beyond my, it's not above my pay scale, let's put it that way. But the correct balancing act that needs to take place is legitimate to shut down and prevent the spread of infection. There's no question that vulnerable people need to be protected in the extreme. And yet lives are on the line when you close down society as well. It takes wise judgment about where to lock down a society, and it depends on the society. My daughter lives in South Africa, told me that when the first lockdown occurred there, after a few days, she got a call from her local maid who helps her in her house. The maid said to her, if you don't employ me today, I don't eat today. It's not talking about tomorrow. If I don't work today, I don't eat today. So those are life and death questions as well. You ask me exactly where the balance should fall at which point in time. This is a question for authorities to take into account the science and walk that narrow line defining that balance. I think that the balance changes over time. When there was much more unknowns about COVID, it was legitimate to take more radical action. Now that we're learning a lot more about the disease and its spread and who's vulnerable, we can take slightly more laxity and flexibility in the decision when a vaccine comes online. That will also aid things, but it's a constant balancing act between societal needs and individual needs.
Well, we're very excited to say that our shore will be open again next week. It's a quick opportunity to remind everyone to join us for the services in a COVID-safe environment. The next question somebody's asked is about, you spoke about your brother being priority number one, family, charity starts at home. What if the unsalvageable in front of you is your brother versus somebody who's salvageable, but it's a stranger? Would that be a consideration or presumably not?
Yes, so your brother definitely comes before a stranger. This does not apply in a hospital scenario where you have no authority to use the facilities for a relative over someone else. It would only apply in a desert situation. For that reason, a Jew would come before a non-Jew. They are more closely related to you than the non-Jew. And all else being equal, a relative would come first, indeed. Indeed.
Okay. We've had another question here from Howard Calvert, slightly off topic, but again, because it's Howard, how can I not ask this question? In 1 minute, Rabbi Tatz, the point of death in terms of organ donation, the laws changed in the UK with the opt-out as opposed to opt-in. But if a heart can be kept alive forever, can we donate organs? What is the point of death from a Jewish perspective?
Okay, the fascinating question. This actually includes 2 questions. One is, which is the point of death? And a more sophisticated question I can see Howard is asking, if you can keep a heart going, does the person ever die? That's a fascinating question which has recent application. The first question I'm going to refuse to answer in detail because it's an extremely vexed and complicated question. What is the moment of death? If you are kind enough to invite me back to
Look at that, Howard. What have you done? On a cliffhanger. Rabbi Tatz, please reconnect. Somebody plug in a live sport machine to his Wi-Fi, please.
What a shame.
So from our conversation, Yoni, this is the opening.
All I can say is, Howard, this is such a fascinating discussion. We're going to have to do an education program just about this very topic. As I mentioned last night, I don't know if you saw my comments in the group chat. I had my first cousin passed away from complications with a lung transplant, and it's a very, very personal topic to me. Rabbi Tatz is back just in the nick of time. Rabbi Tatz, that was a sneaky way to try and get out answering that question.
Let me say only this, that in traditional Jewish societies, as you know, the Chevra Kadisha put a feather under the nose of the person who is suspected to have died to see whether there's no more breathing. In 1980, a President's Commission in the United States brought about a change to brainstem death definition, and rapidly accepted throughout the world, which means that you can have a heart beating spontaneously, respiration kept going on a machine, but no brainstem function. That is very good news in terms of transplants, because if you can define such a person as dead legally, well, then you can take the heart while it's beating. And that is what facilitated transplants. Judaism is very, very torn on that question. The right-wing, let's call it the right-wing Orthodox world, including the London Bet Din, have always come down on the side of requiring cardiorespiratory failure and cessation, and not to use brainstem as a valid criterion. There are learned rabbinic authorities in this generation who feel you can, in fact, do transplants. You can use brainstem as a definition. In fact, the Israeli chief rabbinate accepts brainstem death, and therefore in Israel, a very active transplant program is underway. It has lots of checks and balances. It's more stringent than other countries, but nevertheless, it is accepted. So I say only in summary, there are two opinions. The more, let's call it conventional right wing in the Orthodox world, has not accepted brainstem death, which means you cannot do heart transplants under most circumstances, but that is still a highly debated question. The more sophisticated aspect of Howard's question, if you can keep a heart going, what would that mean? I very briefly referred to this. It's a fascinating question. To solve this ethical dilemma, the non-Jewish world recently came up with an option. Let's wait till the heart stops. Why should we offend people in their religious sensibilities? Let's wait till the heart stops and take it immediately. This is called non-cardiac or non-heart beating donors. Let's not use brainstem death. Let's satisfy everybody. Let's wait until the moment the heart stops. And then it stopped. Everybody agrees. Let's take the heart. But Howard's question reveals the problem with that definition, with that approach. What will you do? You wait till the heart stops. Now everybody agrees the person has died. But 1 second, you're going to take that heart and implant it into someone else and start it beating again. Well, if the heart can be started again, why didn't you start it again in the donor and resuscitate them? Is that real death? You see, the halachic definition of death is irreversible cessation of heartbeat, not a heart that you could start up again. If you could start it up again in the person who just collapsed. And this has bizarre consequences. This is, again, beyond amazing. If you say that a person whose heart has stopped is by definition dead, then what happens to the person in the operating room when they stop the heart to operate on it and do some stitching and some repairs? Half an hour later, they start the heart again. Was the person dead because the heart was stopped and they've just been brought back to life? Or were they desperately ill and their life was saved? Think about this. If you say the person was dead and we brought them back to life, number one, there's no mitzvah to do that necessarily. Number two, his wife was a widow for half an hour. If she was conducting herself in an intimate relationship with another man at that time, I mean, a little insensitive, you'd agree, but not adultery. Her husband was dead, and furthermore, his children just inherited all his wealth. He has to beg them now for a cup of coffee. I mean, there are massive consequences. If you say, however, that person, and if you're a Kohen, by the way, performing the operation, get out of there because he's dead. However, if you say that the person is not dead, just desperately ill, all that would be vitiated. In fact, we follow the ruling that it's not only cessation of heartbeat, it must be irreversible, which means that this trickery of saying, well, we can start the heart in someone else, and that is not so simple, and many non-Jewish ethicists have criticized it for that reason. Okay, is that it, Rabbi Golka?
Rabbi Tatz, thank you so much for an unbelievable session. I think just if I could add, if I'm correct in saying that the Israeli rabbinate and the chief rabbi of Israel, his ruling is based on the way in which Israeli hospitals deals with the situation, whereas in the UK, we don't have that governance over the hospital system. Is that a correct differentiation as well?
If I may, Rabbi Golka, in Israel, a lot of the medical ethical decisions, despite being made by
I think we have lost Rabbi Tatz, and I think I'm going to use this opportunity to thank him. We're going to leave it on the cliffhanger. I just want to say a huge, huge thank you to Rabbi Tatz, whether he can or can't hear me, for explaining such incredible insight to a wonderfully complex subject in a very listenable, enjoyable manner. And please God, I hope we can invite him back with a better Wi-Fi connection to conclude this session. And can I thank all of you for bearing with us and having such patience. And thank you for joining us. As promised, I'm going to conclude that video that I started earlier, but feel free to leave as and when you wish to. Please, God, we look forward to you joining us for many more series again. Are you back, Rabbi?
I think it's time to call it a day, if I may say so.
I just thanked you, not within your earshot, but thank you so much for a fascinating, incredible evening, explaining a very complex issue in a very simple way. We'd love to invite you back. We'd like to, please God, sponsor a better Wi-Fi connection for that event. But thank you very, very much for gracing us this evening.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. All the best to everyone.
Wonderful. And to you. Stay well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, as promised, feel free to leave the Zoom meeting. As promised, I will conclude the session with the conclusion of that video that we started watching earlier. You're welcome to leave whenever you wish, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry. 1 sec.
What's that?
He was so mad at me.
And he says, Joel, I will never forgive you for what you did. I don't ever want to see you again.
I did not speak to him 20-something years. I do know that he was having a really hard time with the law.
He spent so much time coming back to California, going to court, hiring lawyers, trying to clear his record, but all to no avail. 25 years later, Yechiel has moved on. He now lives in Far Rockaway. He's got a family of his own. He hasn't thought about the story in years. One day, he meets a guy. And in the course of the conversation, he discovers that this guy's name is Bess.
He goes, are you related to Bess in Los Angeles? Joel Bess.
The guy says, Joel? Joel is my brother. He says, he's your brother? I need to talk to him right now. Joel's brother calls up Joel. He says, Yechiel wants to talk to you.
Yechiel says to me, he goes, I need to tell you a story. When is the next time you're going to be in New York? I said to him, just tell it to me now. He goes, no, I need to tell this to you in person. I come to New York the next week and I call him up and I said, I'm in New York now. And he comes to my brother's house and he says, Joel, I'm going to tell you a story. You're not going to believe it.
10 years after that incident with the car, I graduated from college, I studied finance, and I was looking for a job.
I had been given an interview. I remember at the time that it was a pretty much guaranteed job. After the interview, they told me, okay, go to Human Resources and just fill out the employee paperwork. Got the paperwork. I filled out all the questions. The last question on the paperwork was, were you ever arrested?
And I thought to myself, yes, I was, but it wasn't my fault. I checked off yes.
I never, ever heard back from them. They obviously didn't want to hire somebody who had a record, and I never got the job.
Joel at this point feels terrible, and he begins apologizing again to Yechiel. He says, Yechiel, I'm so sorry. Yechiel grabs Joel's arm. He says, Joel, listen, it turns out that the criminal record that you gave me saved my life, because a short while later, 9/11 happened. Thousands of people died. Had I gotten the job in the World Trade Center, I would have been there on that fateful day, and I wouldn't be here talking to you today.
If I wasn't sitting in that jail, I could have been working in the World Trade Center. Who knows what would have happened.
When I heard the story, I wasn't like, oh God, I'm so happy that I stole the car. It was that even during the stupid times when I'm making stupid decisions and the regrets that I had for it, even then, God has a plan. And even then, everything is done for a reason.
But the most incredible part of this whole story came when we actually filmed Yechiel, and we asked him if he has any court documents from when he was fighting the battle. He took out the papers, and even Yechiel himself didn't realize this until now. The expungement letter, the letter that wipes his record clean, we couldn't believe our eyes. The day the judge sent him the letter was marked 9/11.
It was right after the interview. Obviously, if I would have had the interview after this, it wouldn't have been on my record and I would have been working there. So, yeah, another crazy part of the story. Nothing is really in our control at the end of the day. You know, we do the best we can as his people, and God and his master plan take care of the rest. So I definitely learned that lesson from that day.
It's a very apropos way to end the evening, that Hashem runs the world. We talk about transplants, we talk about donation, we talk about triage. Ultimately, Hashem runs the world, and that story is a keen reminder to all of us. I wish you all a fabulous evening. Feel free to unmute yourself if anyone wants to make any closing comments. But thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Johnny.
you.
Wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Good. Brilliant.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Jon.